So this is a video I've actually been planning on making for a long time. I've been meaning to do more tier list videos, and there are a few other ones I have in mind as well. Ranking the boss battles in the Storm games is definitely something I could see myself doing, but the reason why it took so long for me to make it was, well, to put it simply, it'd be too long, and I have a feeling editing this video will be an absolute nightmare. But now I decided to do it after my friend Internet Claude basically had a precognitive dream about this exact topic, to which I saw that as a sign to finally bust my ass and write this video already. Much like my reviews, I'm gonna split this into two different videos. This one will exclusively talk about the trilogy, the next video will be about Storm 4, and there might even be another related topic I have plans to write about. I'll talk about it later in the video. For now, let's just start already with the humble beginnings. So when it comes to Storm 1, I think everyone can agree that it's not exactly a gold mine of boss battles. I'm gonna be a little bit generous with them, especially with the last one, which arguably doesn't even fit the criteria. But as for the Gamabunta boss battle, this one goes to F tier. It's pretty boring and nothing really all that noteworthy, other than serving as the architecture for what was to come. The next two ones, while certainly big improvements, they are also emblematic of the problem with the game's boss battles in general, which is that they're formatted kind of the exact same way, where you face a giant boss that has a wider range than normal and has a limited area of effect for the player to attack, as there are only certain periods when you are granted the opportunity to hit them with normal attacks, like when they have their arm attached to the ground, or when you can double jump towards them in a few instances, while in the meantime you have to both dodge their attacks and hit them with projectiles. It's one thing when one of them is like that, but when you have three of them structured the same way, it kind of takes away the uniqueness present in some of the later games where, granted, they're all also a little bit formulaic, they still try to mix it up with the mechanics. Of course, that's not to say they don't have their merits. I do like the cutscenes that play before and after the battles. I have a bigger preference for the Gara fight because I enjoyed the music played in both cutscenes and during the battle itself a lot more than the ones present in the Orochimaru battle. I also like the way the scenes are animated and colored. I really vibe with the sunset setting, and of course, this goes without saying, both battles have good quick time event scenes that are worth revisiting. The one advantage I'll give to the Orochimaru battle is that it's a little more unique than the other two because of the assists, and also the fact that you can climb Manda's head and beat Orochimaru. But besides that, I would still rank Gara above because of the superior presentation and my own personal opinion of the portion of the story it adapted. Although regardless, they're still C tier, I can't rank them any higher. The only one that's left is Naruto vs Sasuke. This one goes to D tier for several reasons. For one, it would be a lot more exciting if this had been the first time we were granted their awakening forms, but instead you can actually access them in both free battle and during story missions. The only thing you didn't have access to is the pre-unlocked awakening versions, which although might be a noteworthy achievement, I feel like it would be a lot cooler, like for example in Storm 4, where I could only play the 6 Paths characters after I'd reached the point in the story where they showed up. My second problem with this boss battle is that it's just a worse version of the Ultimate Ninja 3 and 4 same exact fights. Like, yeah, sure, it has better visuals and all, but Hero Mode was a lot more effective at creating build-up, which is a problem I have with all of the Storm 1 boss battles, by the way. Also, the music is just way fucking better. You can't tell me that any of the tracks that played during the entire event is better than the songs Friend and Rasengan vs Chidori. In fact, Ultimate Ninja 3 slaps in the music department, and I'm not even sure Storm 1 can compete, honestly. The last point against this boss battle, and it's probably the most critical one, there are 0 quick time events. So in the end, it just feels like a regular ass battle with almost the same rules minus assists. For the last boss battle, this is pretty bad. The only credit I can give to this is that it's maybe harder than the usual missions, but generally it's a very disappointing boss battle. But now that we've sorted out all of the low ends, let's get to a shiny beauty, which is the first match in Storm 2, Naruto vs Kakashi. This one is definitely an A tier. I've played the Storm 2 demo several times, so I know exactly how good this is. I think the best way to appreciate just how much of a landmark this is by comparing it to Ultimate Ninja 5, a game that adapted the same fight in the main campaign. But with Storm 2, you can really see just how much Cyber Connect 2 were striving to take advantage of the jump in the console generation to offer some stunning visuals, not just in terms of how well animated they are, but also in terms of how they help to carry the narrative with little scenes of characters exchanging dialogue and changing their strategies as a way to adapt to the situation. They did more to play around with the level design, where at first it started off as a normal battle, but then later Kakashi took advantage of the damage Sakura did to the field by electrocuting the water, which forces Naruto to move to safe spots. Plus, he also used a water jutsu to travel around the water and giving us an even harder time. Of course, with all of these advantages, we still have Sakura as an assist to bring Kakashi to the ground so that we can inflict as much damage as we can to him. This plus the quick time events really adds a lot of momentum and exhilaration, which is exactly what I seek. The match itself is pretty easy, but I can understand that since it's the first mission, and you still need some time to get the gist of how it works, and then as you play the game, the difficulty steadily increases. Even then, in terms of giving us a glimpse of what was to come, it holds itself back from hitting emotional highs, but it's also a nice experience with both funny and intense moments, and it's visually stunning enough to leave a strong impression, which is the right balance to reach for a first boss battle, and that's why it's an A tier in my book. Next up is Gar vs Daedra. This one's a bit tricky. On one hand, I want to give it an A tier. I commend it for being a projectile-centered match, Daedra being a long-range opponent that has a lot of aerial advantage even at the start of the match, which normally kicks off with opponents acting exactly how they're designed to play as in free battle, but this battle revamped them even from the very beginning. Then later the match turned into a chase scene, giving us an aiming mechanic that had us solely rely on projectiles with some QTE sprinkled in. It's also one of the few boss battles that expand on the setting to the skill that they did, allowing us to witness the Sand Village to an extent beyond usually being centered on the same area. And they did it in a way where they didn't have to design an entire three-dimensional location for the characters to navigate. Instead, it's on autopilot, which I'm sure allows for better management of limited resources, where it's mostly the scenery that changes and you're only tasked to aim correctly at Daedra. I think it's a cool boss battle, but I can't really say that it reached a lot of highs for me. In the end, it's mostly a setup for the arc, not exactly a major highlight. I also wouldn't necessarily consider the playing experience to be that remarkable, although I do appreciate the second stage for being a projectile-based fight. It's not necessarily representative of the most enthralling gaming experience. It's mostly impressive as a variety landmark and not necessarily the most interesting mechanic explored. So with all that said, I give it a B tier, which is still positive at the end of the day. Let's move on to Sakura vs Sasori. This one goes to A tier, so much like how the previous boss battles went through a change in the setting as the fights progressed, this one did as well, and the changes felt even more blatant due to the lighting of the scene. Because it initially took place in the Akatsuki hideout, the setting looked a lot darker until they eventually went outside, which highlighted the atmospheric difference in a way that further adds to the immersion, especially after we had previously seen the outside of the hideout, which was pretty sunny. So this is a boss battle that truly excelled when it came to the visuals. They really took advantage of the puppetry present in it to create some striking imagery. They especially succeeded at making Sakura and Chiyo look like total badasses in that fight, especially Chiyo, who came up with some creative tricks to find openings to attack Sasori. Plus, while obviously Sakura would have been the front stage character there because of her role in the story, I also think it was more optimal for the experience as well because puppet users in the Storm games are kind of a mess to control, so her being more of a support during normal controls and the orchestrator doing the quick time events was definitely the best way they could have approached, as they can better take advantage of Chiyo's interesting arsenal of attacks for cool visuals. This is also a battle that nails at maintaining momentum during the quick time events, constantly keeping you at the edge of your seat because of how fast and intense the events are. I had actually considered putting this at B tier, but honestly, every time I experienced this fight, it was an absolute banger, so I'm placing it at A tier and above the Kakashi battle. Next we have Naruto vs Orochimaru. I was very close to putting this at A tier, however I feel like the only reason I rank it that high is because I love the fight in the original manga. In Storm 2, while it is a fun time, it does draw a lot of parallels with the Daedra boss battle, where during the second stage you now only have projectile based attacks and your movements become limited. I think I would have appreciated more if I could control Naruto's awakened state, but I might be able to understand wanting to reserve that for the last boss battle, which, don't worry, we'll get to that. There is definitely some striking imagery lent by Orochimaru's swarm of snakes occupying the battlefield in the second stage, and Naruto's visually distinct aura and blasts. It's definitely a good time, but one thing about these boss battles that come up either at the beginning or the middle of a chapter is that they tend to exhibit somewhat of a disadvantage compared to the final ones from each chapter because of how those ones tend to have more build-up and bigger anticipation, making the climax even more potent. This is something that kind of stops taking effect in the later games, but in Storm 2, this and the Daedra battle do kind of suffer from a bit of inferiority compared to the chapter-ending boss battles, for just kind of being transitional fights. Of course, they are still 100% welcome. In fact, if it had a better second stage, I might have even considered putting this at A tier, but B makes more sense. I also would have liked this more if they had Naruto transforming into the four-tailed cloak back in the Tenchi Bridge. It's a small detail, but I think the transformation could have felt a lot more atmospheric if it hadn't happened in the middle of the boss battle, which would force them to speed it up in order to not break the momentum. I'd say it's better than the Daedra battle, mostly because of the visuals, but they're still in the same rank. Next, we have Naruto vs Sasuke. Ladies and perverts, we finally reached the first S tier boss battle. Now, as we go along, we're going to see more boss battles that are like that, but this was the first time CyberConnect 2 experimented with the idea of switching between eras in the middle of the fight, where we occasionally see flashbacks of the Valley of the End fight popping up, and even at times, we see them referencing scenes via quick time events. It is definitely not faithful to the actual fight that occurred in the manga, but due to it being a video game, I can recognize the need for them to make a few compromises to better take advantage of techniques they have in mind, and I think the way they went about it was emotionally impactful enough to be justified. They paid homage to Ultimate Ninja 5 by having it take place in Orochimaru's hideout before it was destroyed, and also had us re-experience the final battle in Storm 1 by letting us play with the models of the characters that aren't even available in the game anymore. Also, may or may not be a spicy take, but I think Acquaintance from long ago is the best theme that played in all the Naruto vs Sasuke boss battles in the Storm series. If we're counting the PS2 games, I do prefer Rasengan vs Chidori, but for the later generation, aside from maybe seeking answers that comes very close to being the best, this one from Storm 2 is my personal favorite, and this is only the start of the ever-reoccurring encounters between these two. Will the other ones make it to S tier as well? We'll see what happens. For now, let's talk about Naruto vs Kakuzu. Now, I'm just gonna say for the record that from now on, you won't be seeing any B or under, at least for Storm 2. This one is an easy A. Now, I've talked about my relationship with this battle in my Storm Trilogy review, so I recommend you watch that video. But yeah, this is where the boss battle starts to impose more challenge than usual, which made for a thrilling experience, and even after I replayed it on my PS4, it was definitely not as hard to beat him as it was when I first played this game back on the Xbox 360. Yeah, I used to have that. It was still pretty fun. The music from the second stage is also pretty good, and the Rasen Shuriken attack was done so much justice. The combination of the high quality movements while Naruto was trying to move towards Kakuzu and the timing of the button inputs made for a very climactic result. In fact, this might even be a candidate for top 5 Storm 2 boss battles because frankly speaking, I put this above the first boss. I'm not sure if this is better than the sorcery fight. For now, I'll put it below, but honestly, think it could go either way with them. Okay, before I move on, I should give you all a strong warning. If you haven't watched, read, and played it up until this point, I don't recommend watching this video any further if you don't want to get spoiled. This should be common sense, but I feel like I should especially make it clear right now because what I'm about to talk about is, well, I mean, you've all seen Naruto, you know exactly why. Anyway, Sasuke vs Itachi is a hard S, above Naruto vs Sasuke. Fun fact, if you throw concentrated kunai at the same time as Itachi, it'll trigger a super quick time event. So yeah, just keep that in mind. Now, a lot of the biggest strengths come from the second stage, but even in the first one, can we just comment on how great the music is? It's so dark and depressing, and for anyone who has played the classics, there's actually a part of the song that's a rendition of Sasuke's theme from Ultimate Ninja 1, which is pretty cool. There's so much care put into recreating iconic shots and atmosphere emitted by this encounter. When we get to the second stage, in fact, I'd actually say it's more accurate to split this into 3 stages, because the second one is where you fight against Itachi's Susanoo, which is pretty nice, I would say. I do question the way they decided to design it, where the Susanoo seems to not cover Itachi's whole body. Instead, it's like standing behind him and it mostly only protects him with the Yata mirror, which is definitely odd, but whatever, I don't mind it all that much. I can see the reasoning behind it from a game design viewpoint because otherwise, I feel like this stage wouldn't be as interesting to play if he just had it all covered and would either be immune to damage or we wouldn't be as incentivized to tactfully find openings for damage. Then we have the third stage. This is undeniably the highlight of the entire boss battle. They had us experience Sasuke's helplessness as he attempted to send as many attacks as he could, but not only was he too exhausted, but none of his attacks even worked. Everything from sword attacks to paper bombs couldn't do anything to damage the Yata mirror. I just remember when I first played this feeling so confused and worried about what to do, and the music brings this feeling of despair and fear. Of course, this is better enhanced when you take into account the story, and this had been a highly anticipated fight which is better appreciated once you experience the following cutscenes that recontextualize Itachi's character. I do think that it's important to highlight those things because they are a major part of the experience. It's what gives emotional weight to these fights. This boss battle also has the most memorable secret factor. It felt overwhelming because of the overlapping voices, but in a way it represents what's on Sasuke's mind. A clusterfuck of feelings and memories of his brother with a creepy filter that makes the imagery even better. This is a second S tier in this video and it certainly won't be the last. Because the next one is definitely another S tier, which is Jiraiya vs Pain. And I would actually put this above the previous one. I'd first like to point out how cool it is that you can fight against several paths of pain that aren't available in free battle, which gives it a unique experience. Starting off with the animal path was already a treat, a unique opponent with special properties, some of their attacks even leading to a QTE. The second stage is even cooler, where the way it works is that you fight against 3 paths of pain, and you can't defeat them traditionally by beating the shit out of them until their health is completely depleted. Instead, you have to drain each of their individual HP to a certain point, and after that you have to Rasengan them, and even after doing that, they can still come back to life unless they're all stunned simultaneously, so that you can hit all of them with a giant Rasengan. So you have to strategically deal with them in an order that will do the best to avoid one of the paths from getting revived and restarting the entire procedure. It's always a fun fight to revisit because every time I do, I always feel pressured and cornered, and it never fails to bring some entertaining challenge. But of course, there's another reason for why this is so high on the list, and it's the same with the Itachi battle, which is the 3rd stage. I firmly believe that this is the saddest thing the Ultimate Ninja series has ever depicted, and I would honestly throw my fucking rusty coin and go so far as to say this is probably one of the most depressing gaming experiences you could probably have. By having us the player adapt to the habit of working our way towards an end goal in a match, with this game in particular beating your opponent until they lose their health and avoid facing the same fate and inevitably restarting, it feels so hopeless to have all of that stuff stripped away from you. It seriously exemplifies ways to utilize the gaming medium for emotional resonance and putting us at the shoes of a character. Jiraiya can barely move, and none of his attempts at attacking the opponents leads to anything. We're just continuously trying our best to do something, but our HP just keeps steadily getting damaged by the paths of pain ganging at us, and the closer our HP fully depletes, the more we get exposed to the gut-wrenching cutscenes of Jiraiya on the verge of death. But before he actually dies, we get a final quick time event of Jiraiya launching his last giant Rasengan with an incredibly striking shot. Also, by the way, the version of the fight from Storm 2 Remaster gets an A tier because they fucking removed Lightless Struggle, one of the most depressing OSTs that does such a phenomenal job adding to the painful scenery, so much so that its removal genuinely makes the stage worse to me. I'm still really pissed off that they didn't preserve that theme, and I'm not going to boot up my PS3 or buy a copy of Storm 2 just to experience one boss battle exactly the way it was meant to. But putting that aside, this is a treasure. It left a really strong impression on me, and there aren't many that can compete. Well, except for one.
ここより世界に痛みを神羅転生
Naruto vs. Pain is indisputably my favorite boss battle in Storm 2. You want to talk about build-up? Is there any other fight out there in this game that has better payoff than the leader of the Akatsuki, the antagonistic group that has been the most prevalent in this game, facing against the main character of the game, the same person that has been the target of this group throughout the story? Also, after the same antagonist killed one of the most beloved characters in the most devastating boss battle in this game and utterly destroyed the village that we grew attached to, the same one that we got to roam around several times. I've also mentioned this in the past, but I really appreciate what they did to the stage. It looks so dark and cloudy, much drearier looking than if you were to compare to the anime, and I personally prefer this aesthetic more. There's so much iconography present here, not just in the quick time events, but also in the movesets. One of the reasons why I love playing as Sage Naruto is not just because he's the final battle form that wasn't playable in the story mode up until this point and after training in the Mount Myoboko, but also because every move he has is a reference to the fight in the manga, which is so fan-servicey. Then there's the music. I honestly don't think there's any song that's more iconic than He Who Howls and Rages in Storm 2. The second stage of this fight allows us to control Naruto in his Nine Tails form, but the way he plays is different from when he's awakened due to the fact that his movements are a lot faster, floatier, and his jumps are more elevated. It's something that I don't think would work very well in free battle, but for the story mode I can appreciate it as a unique experience, especially because of the circumstances of the mission and the spatial advantages Pain had gained. This dude can even remove himself from the battlefield and attack us in the background. Despite that, that's not even when Pain is the toughest to play against, because Stage 3 Pain is probably the hardest opponent to fight against. Much like with Kaguzu, playing this game again, I can manage to beat him on the first try, but even still, you can definitely sense a superiority in strength due to him permanently being in his awakened state, amping up his damage, which makes for an exhilarating match. My one complaint is that I wish they had designed the costume to look more damaged like in the manga and even some of the later Storm games. To wrap things up, the story scenes that revolve around this battle are also pretty mesmerizing from a storytelling viewpoint, and the last QTE before Pain dies is one of the most satisfying scenes. I used to think the Naruto vs Sasuke battle was the best one in Storm 2, but looking back, I think the Pain one serves not only as the great final match for the game, but also the most exciting and emotionally thrilling one to experience, which is why I would rank it above Sasuke, Itachi, and even the one from Jiraiya. Now that we're done with Storm 2, we can finally move on to Storm 3, and I have to say, from now on, things are going to be a huge pain in the ass, because the next two games muddy the distinction between various boss battles. Some are debatable if they can even be considered one, others are a bit tricky to decide if they should even be counted as just one or a part of a grand battle. For the sake of simplicity, in Storm 3, I'll choose to only count the ones that are presented as boss battles, tagged as one, and if we see instances where we have two different matches being categorized as one, like the one I'll be discussing next, then fuck it, I'll count it as just one. Maybe I'll give some hypothetical rankings if I had to separate them, but for the final verdict, they'll just be considered one. I'm sorry, but it's the game's fault for organizing it like it is, and once we get to Storm 4, it's gonna become an even bigger clusterfuck. Anyway, the Attack of the Nine Tails. This one is split between two parts. For the overall experience, I'd give it an S tier. I guess what elevates my opinion of this is the fight between Hiruzen and the Nine Tails. It's extremely epic. In a way, it kinda gives some Attack on Titan vibes with the brown lighting emitted by the fire scattered in the village, which also matches the color of the Nine Tails himself. Then there's the sense of unity and duty to protect the village that was communicated so well through the lines of dialogue from the third Hokage. And also through the various combinations we saw between the Konoha elites. We even get to see Team Asuma's parents pulling off some cool combos with similar powers as their children. The music is also fantastic, one of the few instances where vocals are used. The way this battle plays is pretty different from usual. It's similar to the giant boss format we saw in Storm 1 and in some instances in Storm 2, but in this case, the way you go about finding openings for attacks is by climbing at the exact building that's closest to where the Nine Tails is. There are a couple of other ways to set up attacks, like heading to locations that have reinforcements, which can even trigger quick time events. It was a pretty nice treat to experience, and after that, we have the fight between Minato and the Masked Man. This one I feel like plays the role of giving us a glimpse of the less bombastic fights that don't feature a ton of crazy challenges and mechanics, but instead it's structured like a basic match but with the opponent having a bigger health bar and the existence of minimal quick time events. In this case, it was secret action, which can be unlocked in the middle of the battle, and you have to discover what action to take in order to unlock whatever quick time event they have in mind. In the case of Minato vs the Masked Man, you just simply have to chakra dash at the same time as him, so that you can see a recreation of the Flying Raijin level 2 move. I actually don't mind these simple battles. In fact, even the straight up basic ass fights that are designed the same way as normal free battle matches actually have improved because of the addition of dialogue, which helps in the immersion. If I had to split these into two, the Nine Tails fight would remain an S, the Masked Man fight would be an A. It's simple but concise and purposeful, and I really like the music playing in the background. But both of them merge. I'd say it's a boss battle strong enough to put above Naruto vs Sasuke from Storm 2, but below the Itachi battle. Next, we have Sasuke vs the 5 Kage. Now this may or may not surprise you, but I'm gonna rank this at B tier. Now don't get me wrong, there's a lot to like about it. I enjoyed the open arena portion called Mob Battle, reminiscent of the random encounters in Ultimate Ninja 4 and 5, but instead borrowing mechanical features from the regular fighting mode, plus adding a few tweaks in the way it plays, like having a burst gauge that once full, you can activate trigger attacks, or how whenever you defeat an opponent, you can click X and blitz into the next opponent. It was a fresh battle arena mode implemented into the main campaign that definitely does add to the experience, as well utilized for the adaptation for the story events in question. But the thing about this boss encounter is that it also includes battles between Sasuke and some of the other 5 Kage, and the fights themselves aren't really that interesting. In fact, if it weren't for the bigger health bars, they would honestly be indistinguishable from regular story matches. There are no unique challenges explored, no quick time events or secret actions. The best that they offer are cool cutscenes before and after the matches, so I'd have to be extremely charitable for me to put it any higher. I think B tier is a fair choice. I'll even put it above the Orochimaru boss battle, even though I think that one has better imagery overall. After that, we jump to Naruto vs Sasuke. It's pretty much the same deal as last time. Great reunion, great QTEs, memorable music, really good cutscenes they played before with a lot of narrative weight behind it. They also implemented flashback transitions in the middle of the battle, and depending on which choice you make, they will either call back to the Valley of the End fight or the first reunion. I always end up picking the fight in Shippuden every time I play this, not just because I've already experienced flashback transitions from the Valley of the End fight, but also because the first Shippuden fight goes for a slightly more faithful recreation of the fight, with it now taking place in the destroyed hideout arena. As far as the present fight, it's not really all that accurate. In the manga, this encounter was a lot shorter and more uneventful, but here in Storm 3, it was a straight up action-packed fight. They ran towards each other, jumped around, exchanged fists, weapons, ninjutsu. It was fucking fire, dude. Even though they basically did the exact same thing as the first reunion, it was technically not as innovative. I actually preferred this fight over the previous one. Choosing where to place it, I'd put it just below the Ninetales attack, and I would consider both reunions strong rivals, but with the Storm 3 one taking the lead. Now, the following one is going to be a bit complicated to rate, which is Naruto vs the Ninetales. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and say that under normal circumstances, this is an A tier, no question. It's an extremely epic thrill, managing to be a landmark of an event due to it being the first time we as the players finally defeated the Ninetales as Naruto, and by the end we finally gained access to KCM mode, something that will later be utilized up until the final battle, so it's definitely an important event. It's also a quasi-sequel to the first ever boss battle in this game, with the music sharing a lot of resemblance with the Burning Leaf. While Round 1 was already a pretty good experience, with the QB being a fun and exciting opponent with scary attacks, the second round serves as a great conclusion, with Kushina as an assist character capable of protecting us against deadly Biju Blast by restricting his movements with her chains, and the quick time events are also pretty cool with a lot of teamwork present in it. There's also a great cutscene that plays before the second round where Naruto finally meets his mother, and there's a lot of justice done to this event in the manga, successfully recapturing a lot of the charm and heart from the special meetup, which contrasts from the intense atmosphere from the first round and the dopamine received from witnessing that sweet mother-son meetup, especially after Naruto was being overwhelmed by the amount of hatred swelling inside the Ninetales chakra when he tried to obtain it the first time. It truly boosts your energy and motivation for defeating the Ninetales, especially with Kushina now being a huge help in the battlefield. However, this is part of the reason why ranking this is a bit tough. You see, I've already established that cutscenes revolving around a boss battle are important to take into account. They can give context, narrative, and emotional weight to those fights, and I think the cutscene I talked about can be counted. It's 100% reasonable to do so. But then there's the following one that plays after this entire boss encounter, the one that depicts the birth of Naruto and the death of his parents. Should I count that? I'm more inclined to say no, just because I think it's too extended and separate from the match itself that it would be a bit of a reach to say that it should be accounted for the ranking. But at the same time, it is technically a part of the event, which is that of Naruto meeting his mother and gathering the Ninetales chakra. These two are not apart by any means, and that cutscene is, on some level, a reward for finishing that match. So if that's the case, should it be taken into consideration? Because if it does, this boss battle is an ass. That backstory is one of the highlights of the game. Now, I'm still not going to consider it as a factor to determine where to rank this, which is why I'm still putting this at A tier, currently at the top of the second best rank. We'll see if it remains that way. Now let's get something that's even more complicated, which is the fight against the reanimated 7 Ninja Swordsmen. So there are two ways you could view this. You could either count the mob battle between Guy, Sakura, and Lee against the Mist Swordsmen as its own thing and not associated with the actual boss battle that comes later, but since both of them are tagged as the same, I'm just gonna go with that. But I guess if I had to split them into two, the first match would be a B, and the Kakashi vs Zabuza fight would be a close S, leaning towards an A. But combined as a solo experience, I can pretty confidently put this at S. When it comes to the first match, a lot of the appeal comes from the benefits of mob battles, which is that of uniquely fighting against multiple opponents, and this fight was even more exciting than the previous one because of how harder it was, and also historically meaningful to fight against the legendary 7 swordsmen of the myth, and they have more interesting gimmicks to explore and deal with. But of course, my fondness mostly comes from the Kakashi vs Zabuza match. One of the reasons why I like the flashback transition is that they allow Saber Connect 2 to recreate moments that they never had the chance to. As some of you might know, Storm 1, aside from not having that much of a deep story mode, it also doesn't adapt the Land of the Waves arc, so we never really got to play against Haku, Zabuza, or even see the Naruto Bridge arena in any of the story mode campaigns unless you want to count the one in Storm Generations. but thanks to the flashback transitions we get to see that, plus secret actions and quick time events that recreate iconic moments, all contextualized in a way for us, the audience, and the characters to reminisce on memories from the past as they reunite once again, but in different circumstances. For instance, when Haku once again took the right carry to protect Zabuza, calling back to the Naruto bridge allowed for Kakashi to highlight how in the past, Zabuza hesitated to slice through Kakashi with his sword because of Haku being in front of him, but in the present fight he didn't hesitate in the slightest, not only showing how his Edo state had completely taken away his free will, but it also further proved that Zabuza, despite being someone who used to believe in ninjas solely being tools for executing their orders, like killing for example, he was still someone who had it in him to show emotion by even just hesitating to slice Kakashi. Meanwhile, now in his Edo state, where he has no free will, he really did just become a tool. Also, the music references song from the PS2 games. I know they played Haku's theme, but I'm not sure if Zabuza's theme is also there. There are some portions of the song that kind of reminded me of Farewell Demon, but I don't know how much of that was my own projection of it, or if it was deliberately composed to sound like it. It could be either way. Anyway, I love this fight. Once again, if we're counting both as an entire package, I'd say it's below Naruto vs Sasuke from Storm 2. Okay, so we have a few ones left, and I feel like I should probably discount some others that might arguably be considered boss battles but aren't technically. Daori vs Kinkaku and Genkaku. It's labeled as a mob battle in the Ninja World timeline, and it doesn't have any boss tag, so I'll just discount it. It's a good fight though. Team Asuma versus Asuma. It's also not tagged as a boss battle, even though it does kind of meet a lot of the criteria. Maybe I would make an exception here, but this fight is a little too downscaled to be categorized with the other blatant examples of boss battles, so I'll dismiss it as well. Though once again, a good fight. I'd probably put both of them like beats here. Then there's the demonic statue of the Other Pad. This fight is not that cool. I mean, okay, in all fairness, I might rank this at like B tier above Deidara boss and maybe even Orochimaru as well. I do remember the Ghetto Muzzle being a challenge, forcing me to make several maneuvers in order to dodge and find openings. Plus, this fight has a lot of atmosphere, especially with the context of the story mode, where we're in the middle of the war, and up until that point the characters had already set up troops, as we the players had already fought against several Edo ninjas, and in the middle of all of that, we get to face the legendary Ghetto Muzzle that has a lot of lore tied in with the Ten Tails. It was also neat seeing Choji, who had already proved himself to be a formidable ninja against Asuma, took an even bigger role by elevating his size to fight this threatening opponent, and there's a nice moment between him and his father at the end. All of these things are great and all, but I'd be lying if I said I take a lot of interest in seeing Choji fight this big dumb statue with no personality. Plus, I'm not a big fan of Titan clashes in the Storm games. They tend to be too slow and clunky for my own taste. Although from a physics viewpoint, maybe I can kind of understand the purpose behind it. Anyway, I think that's all I have to say about this fight. There's also B against A that kind of raises a few questions. Honestly, I'm not even going to bother ranking it because 1, it's not tagged as a boss battle, and 2, structurally, it's an even bigger mess because the second match, which is linked to the first one, is formatted as a regular match. So yeah, I ain't touching that. You can hypothesize for yourself where I would rank it. Next, we have 5 Kage versus Madara. Now, this one's definitely an S tier. One thing I want to point out, and this one also applies to the Mist Swordsman as well, depending on which choice you make. But since Storm 3 didn't have a switch mechanic yet, you primarily played with one character. With this fight in particular being Tsunade, and they would grant you endless support gauge to make this seem more like a team play, and as the fight goes, your assist characters would change up, which was a nice way of making the most out of the 5-man group. And the game has a lot of instances where it makes you rely on your assists, like when Madara flies away from the field and stands in one of the wood trunks, and you have to use A to drag him back to the battlefield. And man, this fight is so epic. The extent to which the stage changes to reflect the progress of the match is astonishing. Once Madara unleashes his fireball jutsu, the entire arena starts burning and the setting looks redder like we're in a Hell's location. Madara has a really cool awakening moveset, mixing up the way he fights in the middle of the match and making things more difficult for the players, and the transition is really sick because his awakening gives him access to his extra powers such as the Hashirama wood style jutsu and his Rinnegan, so you'll often see him use Bansho Tenin, something you normally only see with Pain and Nagato. I think this fight did a really good job establishing the threat levels that Madara would have imposed after all the build up, by making him one of the final boss battles and in terms one of the hardest. For me, it's one of the most frequently restarted boss battles, and not just the game, but the whole trilogy. It's mostly the second stage that's the toughest to beat, which is also my favorite part. They really went all in with the teamwork part, with us getting lifted by Gara-san, implementing flying mechanics, and having his projectiles available for us to use, while the rest are also lurking on the battlefield and waiting for your command to dogpile on Madara after the assist meter is full. Meanwhile, we must deal with the Susanoo, who's far larger than us, has bigger range, and hammers you so hard you have to heavily focus on dodging his attacks. As I mentioned in my review of this, you can choose between the Legend and Hero route, and when you pick Hero, the assist command is reserved for Creation Rebirth, which replenishes your health. And while it is a cool detail, I prefer the Legend route for the challenge. I also like how as we progress, his Susanoo starts to crack. This is a lead up to the scene where Tsunade eventually breaks it, overpowering its durability. Now the funny thing about this fight is that later on after it's over, Madara just kind of aborts, not because he admits defeat, in fact he didn't even use the perfect Susanoo. This was obviously because they wanted a way to justify the continuation of the free roaming after the story was over, but I just think it's really funny how the way they went about Madara retrieving was through him being incredibly condescending, which is what I love about him. Speaking of fake endings, before I get to the next fight, let me just quickly say where I would place this. Above the Itachi fight, but just below Jiraiya vs Pain. The battle did enough justice to Madara's introduction to the story. The 5 Kage uniting was a satisfying sight to see. The visuals are splendid. The difficulty levels of this match are enough for me to elevate it above even one of the 3 best fights in Storm 2. Okay boys, now it's time for me to drop a pretty big, very likely spicy take. Naruto vs Tobi is, without question, the single best boss battle in all of the Storm games. All of them. I haven't even talked about the 4th installment, but I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. Nothing there beats this fight. Let me make something very clear. This is only, and I mean strictly only, if we're allowed to combine all of the fights, from the mall battle against the Jinchuriki to the very last one against Tobi, because if they're not being seen as a single experience, of course my opinions do vary depending on specific matches. Now my favorite out of all of them would be the last one, and I would probably even place it at S tier. The rest of them, if seen individually, they do have lower ranks, but the reason why when combined they make for the absolute best boss battle in the series are 3 main reasons. 1. The difficulty. Aside from maybe Sasuke and Itachi vs Kabuto, this might actually be the hardest boss battle in Storm 3. It is not a walk in the park, and small mistakes such as mismanaging your ninja tools and low damage to health ratio can end up fucking with your victory chances. I think the only piece of criticism you could throw at the difficulty is that there is a certain portion during the battle that starts playing unskippable scenes in the middle of the fights, which can be annoying to repeatedly experience them if you're in a position where you're having to restart the match. But besides that, I really appreciate how much they amped up the challenge, especially because of how well you do depends on the stage, and the variation isn't necessarily progressive. In fact, the part where I found to be the hardest was when they were in the full Biju state. This was when I had the most difficult time getting a victory. And what's interesting is that narratively speaking, this actually made a lot of sense. This was when Bee and Naruto were struggling the most to deal with him, and Naruto at this point hadn't yet mastered Biju mode, and later on, Kurama decided to stop being a pain in the ass and actually lent some of his power to Naruto, allowing him to transform to his KCM2 form, and once that happened, not only did his health restore, but facing the Biju also became noticeably less difficult, at least to me. When I was controlling his full body Kurama form, I was having a fucking blast. In fact, the length and diversity of this boss battle is the second main reason why I love it. You play as different forms of Naruto in different circumstances, which really showcases how ambitious they were with this. The third reason is the story. Now, if I were to explain why this is the absolute pinnacle of narrative payoff, this video would go on for way longer than I'm sure it already is, so I'm just gonna have to say that for another time. The only thing I'm going to say is that it saddens me that a lot of people remember this as the unfaithful alternative ending, because let me tell you, this fight and the ending as a whole of this game is straight up god tier. Storm 2 and Storm 4 have great endings to leave you pretty emotional, but the same is true for Storm 3. And the way everything ties in with the plot threads present in practically all the chapters, it's just so brilliantly pieced together. One of the reasons why I don't really want to explain my reasoning is that a lot of it has to do with the story material, which is something that is largely thanks to Kishimoto and not necessarily CyberConnect 2. But the way they went about presenting it, connecting the dots, and finding the most satisfying way to tie all of it together in the end can be attributed to the game as well. And hopefully at some point in the future I can talk about it in depth and don't have to worry too much about focusing on the story. But anyway, enough has been said. I think it's time to talk about the last boss battle, which is Sasuke and Itachi versus Kabuto. I'm going to put this at A because I guess I'm masochistic enough to want to get bodied by Kabuto's abuse of the Sound Force ability. And I really like the quick time events here. They're pretty kino. Nevertheless, I don't care too much about this fight, to be honest. I did enjoy seeing Sasuke and Itachi reunite and fight alongside each other, and the Izanami scene was pretty cool. So there is some appreciation for this fight from a narrative viewpoint, but I guess it's just that I'm not particularly interested in seeing Sasuke and Itachi fighting Kabuto. Like, I feel like out of all of the fights that I would want to be turned into boss battles, this is definitely not one of them. But it's still really good. A tier might honestly be too high, but at the same time, it does deliver a lot of what I like about the Storm battles, so I'm fine with putting it up here. Although it's definitely at the bottom. It doesn't help that it's a DLC hidden fight, so it doesn't even blend very well with the main campaign. But whatever, it's over. It's the last entry on this video. I'm really tired. Recording sucks fucking dick. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you'll check the following video. Also, I guess you can also, read my book if you want. It's really bad, but I should still promote it anyway because it's part of my punishment. Yeah. See you all soon.